Good evening and welcome to the new Bugajski Hour from Washington, D.C. I would like to thank Voice of America for hosting the Washington episodes of my show for RTK. And today I will be discussing important international political and security questions with our special guest on the Bugajski Hot Seat, Donald Jensen, Editor-in-Chief and Senior Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. But first, my political commentary on a key international topic is entitled The China Threat. Although attention is focused on Russia as the main adversary of the West, China is the most powerful long-term threat. Russia is an international aggressor trying to subvert the transatlantic world, but its capabilities will decline. In stark contrast, China is a genuine competitor with a robust economy and a durable strategy designed to surpass the West. China is the world's second largest economy, and its per capita gross domestic product is projected to catch up with America. Its expanding global influence is not dependent on military power, but on economic penetration. It is steadily displacing the US as the leading exporter and importer in a growing number of markets. Beijing is also intent on becoming a world leader in advanced technology. China's Belt and Road Initiative demonstrates its global ambitions, as the new corridor will link East Asia with Europe. Beijing is rapidly increasing investments in many BRI countries and is aiming to alter global regulatory standards to give advantages to Chinese enterprises and undermine the principles of free trade. China's strategy offers substantial financing to dozens of countries along the BRI route, but without protective regulatory and legal conditions. Such tempting offers to boost local economies are difficult to resist, particularly by poor countries in search of capital. The result will be to economically reorient many countries toward China. In the longer term, this could affect their political and strategic orientations. Western institutions will need to implement a strategy that can contain Chinese influence but without damaging the economic development of BRI countries. They must boost Western competitiveness in foreign markets while ensuring that China's investments adhere to international standards and do not push governments into becoming permanent debtors. With more solid economic foundations, China also presents a global security challenge. It is the second largest military spender with the world's largest army. It pursues extensive military modernization with advanced weapons and is developing next-generation technologies. Beijing's military potential will surpass Russia in the coming decade and become a direct threat to the United States. China's intelligence networks penetrate the business sectors of Western states and seek both industrial secrets and political influence. Beijing also engages in sophisticated cyber hacking operations and, similarly to Russia, blackmails or bribes targeted politicians and businessmen. New NATO and EU member states are of particular interest as China intensifies its economic and political inroads into and through the Balkans. It is time now for the Bugajski Hot Seat with Don Jensen, who is a senior fellow at our Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. He's also editor-in-chief of all our publications and one of our leading authorities on information warfare and influence operations. So a lot of material, a lot of ground to cover today, Don. Thanks for joining me.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, let us begin with the big news in Washington, which is the conclusion of the special counsel, the 2-year special counsel investigation of the president. And evidently the Robert Mueller probe has cleared Trump and cleared the campaign team at least of conspiracy, of conspiring with Russian intelligence services to affect the 2016 presidential elections. What is your assessment of the investigation and of the findings?
Well, you know, like everybody else, I haven't read the report. I've read the press releases or press versions of the report. And as you say, they seem to have exonerated the president. But I think it's important to keep your eye on the big picture, which is that the Russians did this. They're likely to do it again. They do it in all the countries of which are targets, especially in Europe, and they technologically innovate at a very rapid rate. So we tend to focus on the elections and how they did that and the trolls, but in fact, they're moving ahead with other ways of attacking our democratic systems. I have no sense, not having read the report, about the details, except to say that I wish people would focus on the policies and not the personality. And I understand the abrasiveness of the personality. So, if you noticed, there's been a marked change in the climate of discussion in Washington in the last week. The president's critics are going apparently to find other things or criticize each other. But I think it's important to keep in mind the big picture, which is this is a fundamental elephant of Russian foreign policy. You can call it information warfare or influence operations. The final thing I would say is that, excuse me, you have to keep in mind that this is one of many tools, information operations are one of many tools that Russia uses in trying to achieve its foreign policy objectives. And the Balkans, for me, is a very interesting area to look at in this regard, because the countries are remarkably diverse in their attitudes toward Russia and the West. I like to compare, in a way, what they do in one country compared to another. So the Balkans becomes, in many ways, like Ukraine, a testing ground for a lot of this kind of activity.
In which case, what you're saying is very important for the public to see the full report, other than sources and methods of intelligence collection and counterintelligence. Do you think it will be available to the public or to Congress?
No, I would say it's not clear. I would like to read it, frankly. But I think that we have a new Attorney General who wants to do a summary, I think, and I think that it will be it'll probably be leaked in its much significant extent, one way or the other, from the Congress. But again, we can't focus just on 2016. This was in some ways an unusual series of events, which is a businessman from the outside in this country becoming president. And again, we have to look at how the Russians operate. I would say a caveat on a lot of this, which is to say, analytically, we don't know the effect of a lot of this very clearly still, Janos. And it's a very ambiguous thing to say they affected this election in Wisconsin or someplace. We just don't know that. And so the impact is, to some extent, still not defined. And analytically, you see an industry of people in the West and in Europe looking at this stuff, as they should, but there's still some conceptual questions we don't really know enough about to make a confident judgment about impact, and thus about how we respond. And as you've seen, especially in this country, the response has been very slow. And we focus on certain things like narratives. Again, the Russians did this, and this is what the Russians did in Albania or Ukraine or Slovakia. But there are other aspects to this, like impact, but there are other aspects as well, which we've sort of ignored, and we need to spend more time on that and not just cataloging a big data. And this is all the narratives the Russians have used.
Right. Before I turn to the two things that the report evidently pinpointed, which was hacking of communications, emails in particular, amongst in the Democratic Party, and secondly, impact on the social networks, the so-called social media. But before I turn to that, what do you think the result of this investigation will be on US-Russia relations? Because that is the bigger, more important picture than any specific report. Will Trump become softer or harder vis-a-vis Moscow?
I think, excellent question. I'll give you a complicated answer, multi-part answer. Trump's policies already are, in many ways, tougher than Obama's on Russia, on sanctions, on other things, on NATO, despite all the rhetoric and all the bitterness.
Exactly.
He has been tough pushing back. I think, to some extent, Obama was lionized for his personality, less for his policies, and Trump is probably the reverse. So I think we ought to give, excuse me, I think we ought to give Trump some credit.
Is it Trump or is it his national security team and Congress?
Or both. Yes, well, primarily the team, I think, but he's ultimately the president, and he's going to take credit for policies taken out under his administration. You raise a very sensitive question. I don't know. I suppose at some level he approves what the policy is. And so you see anomalies too. You see Trump being against Nord Stream 2, which I take to be on grounds of protectionism and all this kind of thing. And other things he seemed to respond very, very slowly. So it's the team or Trump or both. I'm going to be over there next week talking to them, and I think the team is very tough on Russia and largely very effective. We have some problems we're coming into right now, which is, I think, the limits of sanctions as a policy. We have to do some other things that require actual thought and not reflex. But I think that on the Russian side, I think the Russians have given up pretty much on Trump, the Trump administration, as giving them I use the word reset, giving Moscow the kind of reset it wanted 2 years ago. Because I think they see, they blame the deep state. The anti-Russian forces in Washington are not going to
the Russophobic
budge.
establishment.
Trump was a captive of these forces and so forth. But I think whatever they expected, I think that they're disappointed. I think they've written off the administration, although they can make progress on certain things. But I think it's important, two things. It's important not to overestimate Russia's cleverness, which is to say they did this, and they're pretty good at it, and they're clever, but they make mistakes too. And we seem to have demonized them. And I'm a strong Putin opponent. We've demonized them, or given them qualities that are almost omnipotence, and that shouldn't be the case. This is a policy that they're doing like any other, and we've seen the Russians make mistakes, Ukraine most primarily, so we should not give them too much credit. And secondly, I think there's a tendency to see Putin in control of everything. And as you know, and for all of Putin's era, we've talked about the power vertical, and the extent to which it's not a power vertical, it might be a power horizontal sometimes. So I don't think with a Russian president who's reputedly almost ignorant about computers and technology, that he personally is in charge of everything. It's this vast, malevolent bureaucracy with various players and various clans who to some extent compete with each other, probably give Putin information that's exaggerated or incorrect. And this makes the whole process messier than it might seem from the outside.
Although on Trump's side, he tends to be an admirer of leaders that he sees as fully in charge, authoritarian, popular, according to official
let me
polls.
put this carefully. He seems to like those kinds of personalities. I agree. My friends who like Trump or support Trump say focus on the good stuff, or he does his own thing in his own way, which is not a conventional way of elite Washington diplomacy. Perhaps. But I think the point you reference about any space between the team and Trump is critical, and it's something we don't know much about. All I do is I default to the fact that it's the administration's policies. You and I know these people well, and we see the disagreements they have sometimes. But I don't know how person A, advisor A or B thinks. A few cases, yes. But so I think we have to be careful. But good or bad, so it's in many ways analogous to when a U.S. president gets credit for the economy. The economy, and to some extent, is immune from presidential fine-tuning, but he gets credit one way or the other.
Even though it's not a planned economy.
Yeah, exactly. And so my friends who like Trump say, well, he's helped the economy turn around, and I say, well, it started to upturn under Obama, but in any case, what does the president have to do except around the margins? And I think that may be a parallel example.
Well, a good test, actually, you could say, coming up in terms of Obama's relations with his team, is this rumor now that President Putin may be invited to the White House for a visit, and whether there'll be pushback from members of his administration, certainly from Congress.
Yes. I haven't seen the rumor in the last few days, but the president of Estonia has evidently today made gestures to talk to Putin. And so I'm a mixed mind about this. On the one hand, there's the Washington cliche, engage for its own sake, engage on interests of common mutual advantage. On the other hand, send a message and be tough. I tend to lean to the latter. So we'll see what happens. But I do think almost reflexive reliance on sanctions as a tool against almost everything we don't like needs maybe to, and I want tough sanctions, and in Ukraine probably tougher, but that's not always the answer to every authoritarian aggressor around. Sometimes you have to do other things like give the Ukrainians better weapons or whatever it might be, financial aid, or be tougher on those who support Nord Stream 2. Those things are sort of beyond just a sanctions issue.
So what do you think, looking at the next elections, we're only a year and a half away from our next presidential elections, people forget. It's already April 2019, and they're in November 2020. What are the Russians, do you think, are going to focus on? Obviously, it's not going to be exactly the same as they did in 2016. Presumably, that's what we should be looking at.
In terms of the candidate in the election process?
In terms of candidates, in terms of
I think the Russians have learned they can't control a lot of the reaction. And this chaos that they've caused with Trump's selection, I think in many ways has redounded to their disadvantage, because they see, some of them see that the ultimate effect of this is to really poison bilateral relations. Whatever they think about Trump personally, that the meddling has caused a blowback, and that blowback is going to make it very difficult to repair relations. I think they in general have resigned themselves to a decade of very tense, difficult relations with Washington. I don't think they have much hope of improving it, but I do think they hope to cause a little trouble as a mischief, as they always do, to take advantage of opportunities. Excuse me. The Democrats in this country are interesting because the Democrats, of course, 10 years ago were champions of the reset.
And poo-pooing Mitt Romney when he said...
Poo-pooing Mitt Romney, and Romney, I didn't work for him, happened to be right. And
by the way, Romney at the time said that Russia's our chief adversary.
Exactly. And Romney happened to be right. And now the Democrats in many ways are the most aggressively anti-Russian element. The Democrats in Congress, and again, in Congress. Now that has to do not only with the merits of the issue, which is how to contain Russian aggression. It has to do with their still anger, I think, in some cases, that Hillary didn't win, the blaming of Trump for winning, and to some extent convoluting everything to their current political frustration. I think it was interesting last week to see that as soon as the Mueller report seemed to exonerate the president from collusion, the Democrats started to attack other things and go after Joe Biden and that kind of thing, as though the radar is searching for some issues now that they're going to be able to throw out Trump on the basis of the Mueller report. Pelosi has been relatively, I think, more sensible, and I don't usually say that about her, but relatively sensible in terms of not pushing for the maximalist radical Democratic approach to Trump, which would be impeachment or something like that. She held back a little bit, and I think, again, for once, her judgment, I think, has been borne out. So, on the next election, which you asked about, I don't think anything other than strongly hostile Russia, attitudes toward Russia will be in the campaign. You cannot now argue for a softer line on Russia when they've interfered with the elections. And I think even Trump...
Not even the very left? The
left is marginal, I think. But I think you're going to see, Bernie Sanders maybe not, but you're going to see a very hostile debate toward Russia. It's hard to climb down from this now, from the U.S. It's hard for Putin to climb down from what he's been doing. So I wouldn't take Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders and those people very seriously in terms of affecting the debate one way or the other.
On the Russian side, and I want to go through different forms of disinformation, on the Russian side, given that they may not support any particular candidate, will they try and broaden divisions, create more chaos?
Oh yes, I think they will.
In society?
I think they will. I think if you go back in the record about 2015 and 16, it's not, and I haven't read the report as I said, but the Mueller report, it's still not clear to me that the Russians didn't spread their bets around, and that they wanted to cause, a word we use a lot at SIPA, chaos and cause trouble and undermine the system. Now there are those elections in which it's clearly candidates involved who are hostile to Russia and whom Russia opposes, the French elections, where they clearly supported Le Pen, clearly gave her money, the Italians as well, a country I follow closely. But in some cases, they just want to cause trouble and undermine the system. And I think there is an extreme amount of cynicism in Russian foreign policy making. Wes Mitchell was at our office last week and mentioned the same thing. I've rarely seen a country more cynical toward its approach to the world. And I think that however sensible and clever the Russians might appear to play Venezuela or Syria or whatever, on some things they have blind spots, and the U.S. relationship is one of those, where it's driven by resentment and cynicism and all that. So I think you're going to see more of that in the next round of elections.
I think there were reports of certain Russian messaging in the social sphere which was designed to help Bernie Sanders against Hillary Clinton during the primary.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Which is an example of what you said. What we said is they're playing different kinds of games. Different agencies are playing different kinds of games. And it's really a mistake, I think, to think that Putin is in charge of everything with a coherent foreign policy plan. He's very tactical, and he's not very strategic. And they do tactical things which cause problems down the road for them. And I think we're seeing that in a number of places now.
Let us turn to the two forms of Russian interference in the previous election, which will continue in a different form. I'm fairly certain. One is the hacking, and we'll come in a little bit to the social network disinformation. But let me ask you a very sort of straightforward question. The hacking involved primarily Democratic Party headquarters, the Podesta, the campaign manager of Hillary Clinton and so forth. And a lot of this was done through WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has been defined by members of our administration, our intelligence services, as a rogue or hostile intelligence service that's working on behalf, oftentimes, of Moscow. Why is it still allowed to function? Why hasn't it been shut down?
You have to, WikiLeaks, you have to ask them. I would tell you that as a former U.S. government employee, I am not allowed to read WikiLeaks because it's still considered classified information.
It's theft of classified information.
Yeah, I don't know whether they've just not been able to do it or don't think it's high enough a priority. But it is classified. It is a rogue intelligence agency, and it has ties with the Russians and evidently the Chinese. So I don't know why we haven't shut it down. Maybe they find it too titillating to do, but they probably should. This is not a question of freedom of information. This is a question of disclosing classified information and the service of a foreign power, and it should be closed.
Well, if you steal mail that you send out or parcels, you get arrested for it. This is what I don't understand.
Yeah, I don't understand it either. Isn't there runoff offshore somewhere in WikiLeaks?
Could be, but even there you can go after offshore operations, and they continue to function. And there are other organizations, of course, the GRU and FSB have their own operations also.
Yes.
So let me ask you a basic question before turning to this whole propaganda question. I want to spend a bit of time on this. What is the difference between propaganda and disinformation? We often use the terms interchangeably, but there is a subtle difference.
Will you tell me your vision of the subtle difference? I think people are so careless about it, they blend into each other. I tend to think of propaganda, maybe you would differ. Disinformation to me is a much more targeted set of activities with a particular policy goal in mind. To me, propaganda is information on behalf of the state. And to me it's somewhat differently, and I don't know how you would define it, but people always confuse the two. And disinformation is, I think, much more dangerous because it is a much more targeted kind of approach using different kinds of media. Propaganda just thrown out there. But if you take RT, the Russian TV, Russia Today used to be called, that's both really. And I think in disinformation the government role is also much more immediate and close and targeted.
The reason I ask is you've published in your recent report for SIPA, for our organization, you specify numerous techniques used by the Kremlin, and I'd encourage everybody to read this, by the way, it's online. Various techniques used by the Kremlin for spreading false stories and disinformation to achieve certain political goals or social goals or geostrategic goals. I want to go through some of these, because I
Sure,
think it's
sure.
important to dissect these.
Sure.
And to alert viewers to the tools and the forms of manipulation that they may be subject to without even knowing.
Sure.
Which is often the case, whether in the media, whether in their social networks, their Instagrams or Facebook or YouTube, whatever it is. So let me begin with what you call ping pong, which is one of the first things you discuss. I find extremely interesting. Sounds like a Chinese.
It does. It does.
But can you explain what ping pong means?
Well, ping pong is the batting back and forth of topics, which ricochet like a ping pong ball all over the place, and eventually in some channels get currency. And I think if you look at the SIPA website, the report you mentioned, there are 20 techniques like this, and that shows you how insidious these things are and how they work. When I talk about Russia, often I get the whataboutism. Well, you invaded Iraq.
Yeah.
Or you invaded whatever, or Napoleon invaded Russia. And so ping pong is the batting back and forth of these topics in order to disinform, maybe we could say, the listener from what's actually going on.
Which is what they were doing during Soviet times in many
Yes,
respects.
yes.
It's nothing new they've invented. It's just the
Yes,
media's
well,
a
the
bit-
debate is always, is this new or is it not new? And you and I have worked with international broadcasting, although the Soviet times was largely before us. Yeah, what's new now is the high-tech dimension to it. And the fact, I would add, that the fact that the Western democracies are less confident about themselves, and thus this kind of postmodern, what is truth, what is not truth, is something that the Russians can play very cleverly on. I always use the example of fascists or anti-Semites in Ukraine. Well, there's very little evidence of that so-called fascism or right-wing movements is higher there than in many other countries. In fact, it's lower. I think on anti-Semitism, I think Ukraine had the lowest amount of anti-Semitic answers, would you want a Jewish neighbor, than most Eastern European countries. But those two tropes have taken deep root in a lot of commentary on Ukraine. For whatever reason, one of the problems is that when you don't know much about a subject, these Russian narratives get a grip on people's perception much more easily than
And when you repeat something,
you repeat them 100 times. So you will see, I use Ukraine because it's a very clear example. You see the East-West divide, the Orthodox Catholic divide, the Russian speakers, Ukrainian speaker divide in the country, all of which are nowhere near as easy as that. But 2 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, when the Maidan happened, even in Washington, people didn't know much about Ukraine and glom on to those themes. And they're still hard to push out. And that's one of the ways, and I always ask myself, how and why does Russian disinformation work, and how and why does it not work? And it tends to work much more frequently when there's not enough knowledge about the subject. People get good at that.
I remember during Soviet times, they had, however false it was, they had something to sell. In other words, the communist utopia, the coming communist utopia, the alternative society where there is social and economic justice. I mean, these were the themes at the time. Now they haven't that much to sell,
No,
but
they don't.
They
They
have
don't.
a lot to destroy. Let's put it
And
that
they're
way.
trying.
Yeah.
They're trying very hard. And this gives them a freedom because it allows the Russian government to project contradictory stories at the same time to different audiences.
Right.
And it doesn't really matter to anybody, to the Russians. That is not that true because it creates doubt on Brexit or whatever you want to pick as an example. And again, I want to stress the issue of the problems or the self-confidence or whatever you want to call in European and Western democracy and in the U.S. about our system of government is something that they're taking advantage of, and they probably would, these problems would exist anyway, but the moment seems right for this kind of Russian disinformation to sometimes work and advance their objectives.
Yeah, and one effective technique you mention is exploiting balance.
Yeah.
In other words, where mainstream media outlets try to show their balance, if you like, by reporting propagandists from what, or even fake experts. And I would say objectivity is sometimes sacrificed for balance. You know, the two aren't the same, but yet they appear
I like
to
this
be.
example because you and I have both worked for journalistic organizations, and you know the call at 3 o'clock from VOA or RFE to give a commentary on something. They've got a 5 o'clock deadline.
Right.
They've got to come up with somebody else. So they reach for the other point of view instinctively as journalists, and in fact, it's not true. And everybody, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, everybody's entitled to their facts, to their opinions, but not their facts.
Not the facts, yeah.
And so you get Russian demonstrably false narratives legitimized by their being cited so often. On the one hand this, and on the other hand this. And in fact, often the first hand is right, so you don't need to always balance everything. And a good journalist, I don't think, would have to. Still, I'll bring up Ukraine again, after 5 years, they're still talking about separatists. These are not separatists, these are Russian-sponsored proxies under command of the Russian military. But you still see the word separatist used all the time. Yesterday morning, the BBC coverage of the Ukrainian elections. I saw the BBC, not for the first time, using the phrase separatists. Well, why don't they bother? Maybe they don't bother to look at what is going on. And so the separatist idea in Ukraine is still out there because no one seems to bother to correct it. And it's really frustrating if you have kind of trying to find out what's going on. It's not true.
This balance idea, I always give, when people ask me, I always give this example. Well, you're going to have a scientist who say the Earth is round, and then you're going to have a flat earther who says the world is flat. So what, the truth lies somewhere in between, right?
Yeah, that's compromise. Yeah, exactly. It's very, very frustrating because there are some basic things that don't need an opposing point of view. They are just true or not true.
There's enough evidence that you
evidence.
Don't, yeah.
So the Ukraine example I picked because it's a good example of the whole thing in one place on one issue in play, where the Russians define something a certain way, and that's still considered a legitimate way of looking at the problem, when in fact it's not and is untrue, and that kind of thing. The U.S., the Trump business was another example, and Trump, we have this, the Trump case, we have this focus on the collusion argument, which to some extent is very narrow legally and very hard to prove, and evidently the Mueller report, which you mentioned, did not prove it. But there are other things going on rather than just the bipartisan disagreement over whether he colluded or not. And one of those things that's going on is the broader Russian attempt to use influence operations to undermine the West, our elections and the West. And that to me is the fundamental issue, and will continue no matter what Mueller did or found.
There's a number of, I'm just sort of going through the report, a number of other techniques that you locate. One is narrative laundering. We've already talked about this. In other words, injecting information which is simply not true. Tell us a little bit about card stacking, false facts, false visuals, and these techniques.
Yeah. Well, related to all this, I was going to tell you is that RT will go to some crackpot expert in his garage on Skype, and they will talk to them as if this is a serious guy, and it's not. Yeah. But you can, the techniques you mentioned, you can frame the argument in ways that create a certain perception, even though they're not true, and that's what they like to do, and it's very, very subtle, and you end up assuming that what the Russians assume, Russian narrative assumes, is actually true, and it simply is not. And this is a very, as I said with the issue of ignorance, this is a very clever way to spin a certain line in a way to the disadvantage of their opponents and to advance the goals that the Russians want to do in a certain situation.
I remember after the invasion of Ukraine 2014, even friends of mine who generally follow these things said, we don't know who to believe anymore because there's so much coming from Russian sources, or
Yeah.
sources that are citing Russian sources, that this have been a fascist coup, that they want to eliminate Russians, and on the other side that this was a genuine, let's say, revolt against the corrupt government, the will of the people. So I would say the volume of this Russian disinformation is astonishing.
It is. It often gets into history. Now, there's a debate about the founding of the Russian state in Kievan Rus, which the Russians use now all the time to justify the continuity between Kievan Rus and Muscovy and today's Russian Federation. And in fact, it's tenuous, almost. It's like trying to connect Arizona with William the Conqueror. It's just completely ridiculous. But this is a fundamental use of history, which is another technique, to advance your foreign policy goals, and in the case of Russia, to undermine the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state. This is in a book a friend of mine just wrote, and I don't want to name the but this it's unquestioned, this historical view that a lot of Russian people who are fond of Russia and its history and culture argue, and it's simply not true. You have a responsibility to see what happened. And if you're going to use it, make sure that you take the due diligence to actually investigate to see what happened. Otherwise, you're just playing into their hands. This again on Ukraine more of all, because it has everything involved. In Ukraine, the issue of the current fighting and the current negotiations, it comes up all the time because there is a sense in some circles that Putin had certain goals in Ukraine, invaded, or was provoked in their view, and carried out military activities in sort of a seamless, clear way, and that just simply did not happen.
Actually failed in
It
the
did
project.
not happen that way.
Yeah.
If you look at the Trump-Clinton election, there was clearly efforts against Hillary Clinton. There were clearly efforts on the Trump side. There was a mix of stuff. There was money involved, and it's not as easy, and it's hard. And when we go through these techniques and we see how the Russians use them, you can see how seductive some of them are, even if they're not factually true.
Going back, as you mentioned, the campaign again, there's now another debate I've been reading and some articles that the Steele dossier itself was a setup. Not against Trump so much, but as let's say as a backup for Russian intelligence to discredit anti-Trump disinformation.
Yeah, we're getting the negative. Discredit anti-Trump. Yes, I suppose the skepticism and debate will continue forever. This is sort of like we're getting into a John le Carré novel kind of situation here. You can doubt everything. But I think that in general, it's a very difficult thing I'm going to say it precisely. Russia is not probably as strong as omnipotent as it sometimes it seems to be. And we have been very neglectful, we the West, have been very neglectful of capitalizing on some of the vulnerabilities of the regime. And I don't quite get that. Maybe Putin has intimidated us all. Some of these hacking and trolling operations really were garage kind of things run by kids. And it's hard for me to see the coherent evil hand behind it all. It's a scattered, disorganizative process, and I think we have to see it that way, because I think we defeat ourselves if we give the Kremlin too much power, credit for being too skillful, because in many cases they're not.
Well, even their assassination attempts have failed.
Yes. If you look at the series of assassination attempts, I don't know much about them other than what I read in the press, you can see different circumstances which raise questions about who was in charge and why this happened when it happened. The murder of my friend Boris Nemtsov is very different from Politkovskaya and other things. And we're never going to know that, and we always assume that there's more rationality, I think, in the process over on that side than There really is. But I might be wrong, but we'll have to see.
Going back to disinformation again and your report, we talked about this exaggerated focus on balance. And garage experts, if you are experts from their garage on their
They always wear T-shirts, and you can see their posters on the wall.
But there are also academics who have been corrupted or bought or given some sort of favors.
Absolutely.
How pervasive is this, would you say, in the West?
There was a report last May, I think, and I think it was by Open Russia, which talked about Russian money and influence around the world, and it included some very famous places, and many were scandalized. Many said, "What's your?" When you disagree with something, you say, "What's your source?" And so we have this problem. You have people who genuinely support the Kremlin's policy or view on something, and then you have people who are actually bots and are there to spin, and I suppose you could come up with other categories, but I think the most pernicious is the person who carries useful idiots. We use, person who carries out the Kremlin's point of view, and there's many examples, who is paid or given influence or whatever. And I think in many ways the apparent surface innocence of it undermines the credibility. Now, you know the Valdai Conference, which happens every September or October, where Russia brings in a large number of experts who are relatively sympathetic to the Kremlin's point of view, and you ask people, why would you go? And they say, well, there's always a reason that sounds on the surface plausible. It's good to engage them, it's good to know their point of view. Well, yeah, but it also, I think, advances the Kremlin's interest to have so-called experts who come and, but those people are largely, I think, not bought. They are largely sympathetic to the Kremlin's message, and I think that's, how that is possible, given all we've seen, I don't understand it.
Oftentimes it's a sort of, I suppose, camouflaged anti-Americanism.
Yes, I've been told that some of my British friends are anti-American. How can you possibly prefer Russia to America? And there's always some unconvincing rationale.
Right.
John Le Carre, we mentioned him. Excuse me. But the issue of money is very important because a lot of these think tanks, projects, books, articles are bankrolled by the Kremlin or Kremlin businessmen or whatever it might be, and you know them as well as I do, and I would say that it's not just the Kremlin, it's other countries as well, but we're talking about Russia today. And so if someone gives a scholar or an expert money to do a project or cycles the money through this or that, I understand why the scholar is attracted, but I think we should not mistakenly think this academic work that comes out of it will be objective or balanced. That you get money for a reason, and it may not be, and it's probably as more likely that they would give money to a sympathetic expert to write a sympathetic paper than dictate. And this is a pattern that comes up. If you look at Russian information operations, or RT, you don't have to manage every story, and they don't. You have to just pick people who are sympathetic, set an agenda, pick stories that get a Russian message out, and it doesn't have to be so closely manipulated. And I think in that sense, compared to the Cold War, Janis, it's a looser kind of thing right now.
Talking about, there are also cases of Russian oligarchs funding chairs at university or departments at university.
Yes, and we know the universities, and they're very prestigious, and they're not going to give the money back, I think.
But presumably there are some strings attached.
Well, we had a controversy recently here where Hudson gave an award to Blavatnik, I think, the Russian businessman. And, you know, I don't want to take a view about him one way or the other, except to say money and power and all this stuff, they're all blended now, and information is part of this soup. And we have to be much more discriminating. as you know, I teach at Johns Hopkins as well, and I always tell my students the message: whenever you see an article from a think tank or a university, ask yourself who wrote it and who paid for it. And think tanks, including CEPA, are more careful now about this stuff, but some of the others in recent years have been really, it's very difficult to tell. Once you see the pattern of Russian influence or Russian narrative or the Russian agenda, you can see it reproduced in a lot of places. Academia in the U.S., think tank land in the U.S., think tank land in Britain, and in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and in the Balkans, you can see the same kind of thing. Often you can pick it up after the first sentence or two just by the title or something. I can give you many examples, but I won't.
Sometimes it's through third parties as well. For instance, this whole Nord Stream thing.
Yes, yes.
The Russians, presumably, if they're smart, would fund a German organization that supports Nord Stream, a German business that supports, which then funds a project or a university or a particular server.
So very much so. And again, it's subtle, and you have to dig to see the connection.
Yeah.
And elements of the German government, as you know, are really very sympathetic to Russia's agenda in general and Nord Stream in particular. I find the argument that Nord Stream is just a commercial project so ridiculous as to not survive any scrutiny at all. But as you know, the argument is kind of nuanced in a lot of ways. And having just been in Germany, I saw it 2 weeks ago. I saw it myself in some of the discussions we had.
In the report, you also describe something that is prevalent in the Balkans, which is the promulgation of conspiracy theories.
Yes,
which has always been one of my favorite subjects because it's imagination run wild in some cases.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about this and give us a few examples?
Sure. There are certain cultures, and not just Russia, do, as you say, and the Balkans very much. There are always outside forces that are supposedly masterminding, almost to individual specific detail, events that common sense would tell you are not at all masterminded by anybody. And it's the Russians or the CIA or the Washington Deep State or the Masons or U.S. big business or whatever it might be. And this is a very nice way to someone who's uninformed not to give meaning to a series of desperate facts that require actually thinking about. And I find it culturally prevalent in the Balkans. I find it in the Slavic countries. I think it has to do more with their history and their culture. But I don't know if you're ever in the government. There's rarely coherence into what governments do, and I always blame bureaucracy and incompetence for a particularly unpleasant thing. I default really to conspiracies at the very last.
It's more of a tragedy of errors rather than...
now the most, to me, in my own career, the biggest conspiracy was the conspiracy against Gorbachev, which I was there for and worked on about the end of when we discussed and tried to assess what would happen if the Soviet Union ended. And that's a conspiracy against Gorbachev that worked. That was real. It also backfired. But really, I mean, there are very few even complicated international events that are you need to get that level of conspiratorial explanation. There really are very few. There are some, but I would say that the issue of the personality of a leader affecting events is a much more common thing than a common driver of outcomes than a conspiracy. But every place you go, there are always these forces that are doing something, and in a way, the Mueller-Trump business is our own, the U.S. own conspiracy theory that all of this stuff was sort of interrelated and masterminded, when in fact it may not have been.
Well, the big message in the Balkans, from what I can see, in trying to keep countries such as Montenegro and North Macedonia outside of NATO, is Russian disinformation is claiming that the reason they are trying to draw you in is to involve you in a big conflict with Russia.
Yes.
In a war with Russia.
Yes, they would say that, wouldn't they? What's disappointing is that, well, it's not true, but But what's disappointing is that it has a receptive audience. And I think this gets to the big question, which is resilience, and how do you develop the capability of countries and people and societies to see false information and resist it, or even push back. And it's really, really hard, and there's no consensus. There's an agency in Washington which hands out money for research and programs and grants, gives grants to do this, and there's no strong consensus about how to do that. People in the Balkans believe that, I think, and the Russians know it plays upon pre-existing fears of conspiratorial suspicions about conspiracies. It's just not true. It's just not true. How you convince somebody that the conspiracy is not true is really not an easy thing.
It's like Lech Wałęsa used to say, how do I prove I'm not an elephant?
Yes, Gorbachev said that. Yeah, how do I prove you're not an elephant? How do I prove someone, yeah, exactly, elephant or whatever you might want to say. Yes, absolutely.
Well, we're coming sort of to the end of this particular segment, but I would like at some point to have you back to talk about counter-disinformation techniques.
Yes,
we haven't talked so much about the legal side, the media side,
I'd love to.
And so forth. But one last question I do want to raise, which is Russia's not alone. It's not the only country, and you hinted at this, it's not the only country involved in disinformation. And presumably others will pick up on some of the relative successes that Moscow has registered, not just in the US, but also in Europe. Which other countries would you say are the most threatening, the most developed in terms of spreading disinformation?
Well, most countries have some kind of apparatus, but I would say, some people would say the US and be whataboutism. I would say that's not true.
Right.
The Chinese, very much so. Often it's with regard to a specific issue, Arab countries toward Israel or whatever it might be, Iran. They all have an apparatus one way or the other. What you see, though, in the Russian case, probably in the Chinese, is that there's a universality of its use. And thus, when you talk about resilience for next time or whatever, the question of when does it not work also is important. And I don't think, as successful as the talk about little green men were in the Crimea crisis, I don't think anybody believes they're worried about Russia's disinformation operation in Syria, which is pretty extensive. There's very little research on it. The U.S. government called us a few weeks ago asking for the research on China and South Asia, research on Russia and Latin America, and there's very little. There's very little. And I think there's a danger, as much as this is a threat, and I think it's a threat, there's a danger of ignorance, of not knowing enough about how it works, and then how do we develop a strategy to resist it. Because we simply do not know about it. We're alarmed about one thing only, which tends to be narratives or the U.S. elections, but we haven't gotten beyond there, and it's a crying need for more work on this subject. And policies that make sense.
Right. Do you think in our elections next year we may face not only Russian interference, but Chinese hacking, Iranian disinformation? And in other words, it's going to be a lot more messy and more difficult to discern.
So, yeah, I think so. I think so. I think the Iranians probably realize there's no chance of getting candidates that are relatively sympathetic to their... But again, the Russians, they don't have to work for a candidate or an issue. It's enough to cause problems. And I think, given the passions with which the Trump administration has met in its 2 years so far, 3 years, there's stuff in the U.S. political scene that can be taken advantage of by Moscow, and probably will be. But there's also the first and second, there's the technological advances of artificial intelligence, which can tailor messages for you or me or anybody else, and makes it a much more effective kasha of information, because it's tailored to you, not just...
That's another thing we
just some some crackpot.
Well, I was thinking in the case of Iran, it's not that they're going to try and convince the audience here to be pro-Iranian. For instance, there's been a rise of anti-Semitism even within the Democratic Party, which they could play on to deepen divisions in society.
It's a shameful development, and That's something that they could easily cause trouble with. On the Balkans, there is such a complex mix of history and societies and ethnic groups. It seems to me an area where it's tailor-made for Russian mischief. And I think that's why the people there, the societies there, have to be particularly careful to be extra resilient about it, because it's definitely a prime target for Russian disinformation.
A good note to finish on, Don.
Yes.
Thank you very much. That was very engaging, very good conversation. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of today's show. I have greatly enjoyed being with you and with my colleagues here at RTK and at VOA. Good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. See you all very soon. Mira Pavshim.